The far side of the moon is not merely a place of perpetual shadow, as the old myths suggest. It is a physical, impenetrable shield of rock and dust, permanently locked by tidal forces to face away from the noise of our civilization. For decades, it has served as a blank canvas for human paranoia, a convenient hiding place for our wildest science fiction. But the reality of what exists in that silent void is far more unsettling than any fiction we could invent. Artemis II was never intended to rewrite our fundamental understanding of orbital mechanics or lunar topography. It was designed as a pathfinder, a rigorous but straightforward reconnaissance flight meant to throw a crude Orion spacecraft around the lunar sphere, testing the limits of human life support, before we dared to touch the surface again. The trajectory was a classic free return, a mathematical certainty calculated down to the decimal. It required the spacecraft to slip behind the moon, severing all contact with Earth. This communication blackout is a known variable. The entire mass of the moon acts as an insurmountable wall to all radio frequencies. For roughly 45 minutes, a crew is entirely alone, suspended in the deepest isolation a human being can experience. Mission Control expects this silence. They wait for the clock to count down, anticipating the exact second the spacecraft will clear the horizon and re-establish the telemetry link. What they do not expect, and what our current models of astrophysics are entirely unprepared to process, is the encrypted data packet transmitted the moment the signal returns. It is an anomaly that aggressively defies the established geological record of the South Pole Aitken Basin. It is not a fresh impact crater, nor is it a trick of low-angle sunlight casting elongated shadows over jagged regolith. The optical navigation sensors and the laser altimetry recorded a geometric contradiction. They registered a localized disruption in the expected thermal and physical landscape that simply does not belong in a dead, irradiated vacuum. The parameters suggest something massive, mathematically precise, and most terrifyingly of all, something that contradicts the timeline of a lifeless satellite. We have spent half a century aiming our telescopes into the abyss of deep space, desperately searching for whispers of anomalies millions of light years away, completely blind to the silent anomalies locked in our own gravitational backyard. The cosmos is not a benign theater designed for our exploration. It is a vast indifferent architecture of cold physics, harboring hidden realities that can shatter our fragile understanding of the universe. If you seek to look past the comforting illusions of modern astronomy, if you demand the unvarnished truth hidden within the dark expanse, subscribe and join us on this journey. We are about to step beyond the edge of the light. To comprehend the sheer, staggering impossibility of the data captured during that brief window over the lunar far side, we first have to strip away our intuition about how celestial bodies operate. We must examine the rigid, unforgiving mechanics of tidal locking. The moon does not keep its back turned to us by coincidence. Our intuitive understanding of reality is a highly localized evolutionary survival mechanism, engineered solely to calculate the trajectory of a thrown spear or the speed of a terrestrial predator. It was never equipped to process the sheer, indifferent mechanics of celestial bodies. When we look up at the night sky, we are willing victims of a profound sensory illusion. The moon appears static, a perfectly painted backdrop, a serene silver disk that rises and sets with comforting predictability. The human mind craves this permanence. We look at the exact same crater patterns, the exact same dark plains of ancient lava, and we subconsciously assume this is the natural order of things, a peaceful coexistence. But the cosmos does not operate on peace. It operates on the ruthless, unforgiving laws of thermodynamics, mass, and gravity. To understand the anomaly detected by Artemis II, we must first aggressively deconstruct everything your eyes tell you about that glowing rock in our sky. The stillness of the moon is not a feature of its creation. It is the aftermath of a multi-billion-year subjugation. It is the corpse of a spinning world that was violently brought to heel by the gravitational supremacy of Earth. For the vast majority of human history, we were entirely blind to this violence. The Ptolemaic model of the universe, which dominated global astronomy for centuries, placed humanity at the center of a perfect geometric clockwork. The celestial bodies were thought to be embedded in crystalline spheres, rotating in divine, uninterrupted harmony. Even as the Renaissance dawned, and visionaries like Nicholas Copernicus and Johannes Kepler shattered the Earth-centric delusion, forcing our planet into a terrifying orbit around the Sun, the Moon's fixed stare remained a baffling anomaly. It was the Italian astronomer Giovanni Domenico Cassini, in the late 17th century, who first began to codify the precise mathematical laws governing the Moon's motion. Cassini did not look through his primitive telescope and see a divine painting. He saw a locked mechanism. He formulated the laws of lunar rotation, proving mathematically that the Moon's rotational period is perfectly, rigidly matched to its orbital period. It takes exactly 27.3 days for the Moon to complete one orbit around Earth, and it takes exactly 27.3 days for the Moon to rotate once on its own axis. This is not a coincidence. In the cold vacuum of space, coincidences do not exist. There are only forces, masses, and the eventual inevitable decay of kinetic energy. The early astrophysicists slowly realized that the Moon was not born locked. It was forced into this configuration through an invisible, planetary-scale mechanism of friction. To comprehend this mechanism, we have to look at gravity not as a simple downward pull, but as a stretching force, a brutal spatial gradient. Imagine the Earth and the Moon in the violent infancy of the solar system, roughly 4.5 billion years ago. The Moon had just coalesced from the superheated debris of a catastrophic planetary collision. It was a chaotic, molten sphere, spinning rapidly on its axis. Days on the early Moon lasted only a few Earth hours, but Earth's gravity acts like an invisible heavy chain. The gravitational pull exerted by Earth is significantly stronger on the side of the Moon facing us than on the side facing away, simply because it is thousands of miles closer. Over millions of years, this differential force physically warped the Moon. It stretched the young, semi-molten rock into an ellipsoid, pulling millions of tons of mass outward to create what physicists call a tidal bulge. Now, picture the raw mechanics of this reality. You have a massive, slightly oval-shaped Moon trying to spin at high speeds, while Earth's immense gravity aggressively holds on to that bulging mass, constantly trying to drag it back into direct alignment. It is the celestial equivalent of forcing a massive, irregularly shaped steel gear to spin rapidly through a thick, cooling vat of lead. The physical resistance was catastrophic. As the Moon rotated through its own tidal bulge, the friction generated within the solidifying rock itself was immense. This internal friction ground the rock together, dissipating the Moon's rotational kinetic energy as heat, radiating it out into the frozen void of space. By the ironclad laws of conservation of angular momentum, this energy had to be accounted for. Earth slowly, relentlessly bled the Moon of its spin. It acted as an unfathomable gravitational brake, grinding the Moon's rotation down over eons until the rotational speed perfectly, flawlessly matched the orbital speed. The bulge locked into place, forever pointing toward its captor. This phenomenon, tidal locking, is a state of minimum energy. It is a mathematical dead end. The Moon is a captive, held by an invisible leash, permanently shielding half of its surface from our gaze. Even when we thought we understood the lock, the universe offered a subtle, mocking caveat. The Moon's orbit around Earth is not a perfect circle. It is an ellipse. Because its orbital speed changes as it moves closer and farther from Earth, while its rotational speed remains perfectly constant, the Moon appears to wobble slightly in the sky over the course of a month. This visual phenomenon, known as libration, allows us to peek just barely over the edges of the lunar disk, revealing about 59% of the total surface to Earthbound telescopes over time. But that remaining 41%, that dark core of the far side, it remained utterly inviolable, an absolute mathematical boundary that no glass lens, no matter how perfectly ground by human hands, could ever penetrate. The libration only served to tease early astronomers, proving visually that the Moon had deep spherical curvature, while stubbornly refusing to reveal its true back. Because of this brutal orbital physics, there is an entire hemisphere of our closest celestial neighbor that was totally erased from the human experience. Half a world, literally in our own astronomical backyard, permanently hidden in an optical blind spot. For centuries, scientists could only guess at what lay on the other side. Our intuition, once again betraying us, assumed a comforting symmetry. If the near side was covered in the smooth, dark basaltic plains we call Maria, the ancient frozen oceans of lava that make up the man in the moon, then surely the far side would mirror this terrain. It was a perfectly logical assumption based on the data we had. It was also completely, fundamentally wrong. When the Soviet Union launched the Luna 3 probe in October of 1959, sending the very first crude optical sensors around the lunar horizon, the radio telemetry that trickled back to Earth shocked the scientific community. The far side was not a mirror of the near side. It was an entirely alien world. The dark, smooth Maria plains were almost entirely missing, accounting for barely 1% of the surface. Instead, the cameras revealed an absolute wasteland of overlapping violent impact craters, a battered and ancient highlands crust that looked completely different from the familiar face we know. Subsequent orbital missions over the following decades revealed an even more unsettling physical truth. The crust on the far side of the moon is inexplicably thicker. It is miles deeper and denser than the near side. It is as if the moon, in its slow, agonizing cooling process billions of years ago, forged a heavily armored plate on its outward-facing hemisphere. It is a dense shield designed to absorb the kinetic fury of deep space impacts, leaving its softer, thinner face pointed safely inward toward Earth. The far side is a heavily shielded radio-quiet zone, completely blocked from the electromagnetic screaming of human civilization by thousands of miles of solid, dense rock. It is the ultimate cosmic blind spot, a perfect acoustic, visual, and electromagnetic shadow. And it is precisely into this ancient, armored shadow that the Artemis 2 trajectory was calculated to fly. The mission profile of Artemis 2 demanded that the Orion capsule utilize the moon's gravity as a slingshot to test the extreme limits of the navigation systems. To achieve the precise free return trajectory back to Earth, the spacecraft had to dive deep behind the far side, passing a mere few thousand miles above the battered, heavily cratered lunar highlands. The trajectory would take the crew directly over the South Pole Aitken Basin. This basin is not merely a crater, it is one of the largest, oldest, and most violent impact features in the entire solar system, spanning roughly 1,500 miles across and plunging miles deep into the lunar crust. It is a catastrophic scar from an apocalyptic collision that occurred over 4 billion years ago. The physics of an impact that massive should have excavated material straight from the lunar mantle, scattering the deep innards of the moon across the highlands. For planetary geologists, this basin is the Holy Grail, a deep window into the interior of a dead world. The Artemis 2 flyby was explicitly programmed to bounce multispectral imaging and laser altimetry pulses off the floor of this exact region, gathering baseline topographic data to plan future, highly complex robotic landings. The sensors aboard the Orion capsule are marvels of modern engineering, operating far beyond the spectrum of human sight. They do not simply take photographs. The LiDAR systems measure the exact time it takes for a photon of laser light to hit the surface and bounce back, mapping the terrain with a terrifying resolution of mere centimeters. The thermal cameras measure inertia, calculating the precise way the lunar regolith absorbs and radiates the harsh, unfiltered solar energy, allowing deep learning algorithms to determine the density, structure, and composition of the rock buried deep below the surface dust. These diagnostic systems are designed to categorize geological chaos. They are built to measure the random, fractal distribution of impact ejecta, shattered anorthosite rock, and billions of years of random cosmic violence. They are explicitly not designed to process geometry. When the Orion capsule sailed in total radio silence over the darkest, deepest depression of the Aitken Basin, the optical and thermal sensors scanning the void below began to log returns that defied every algorithm written to understand lunar geology. To grasp the profound nature of what the Artemis 2 sensors recorded, you must first understand how a machine perceives the void. The Orion spacecraft does not look at the moon the way a human does, relying on the fickle, scattering behavior of visible sunlight. It interrogates the environment using active, high-frequency light detection and ranging, or LiDAR. This is not a passive observation. It is a physical probing of the universe using the absolute speed limit of reality. The LiDAR emitter on the underside of the service module fires millions of coherent laser pulses every second, sending them slicing through the vacuum toward the lunar surface. The system then waits, measuring the exact nanosecond it takes for those photons to strike the rock and scatter back to the receptor. By calculating the time of flight against the constant speed of light, the onboard computers construct a three-dimensional topographic map of the terrain below with a brutal, unforgiving precision. In a natural, dead environment, these LiDAR returns are inherently chaotic. Lunar geology is dictated by billions of years of kinetic bombardment. When a meteorite strikes the surface, the resulting explosion is a masterpiece of high entropy. The rock shatters, liquefies, and ejects outward in unpredictable fractal patterns. The floor of a standard impact crater is a mess of overlapping debris fields, microscopic glass beads, and jagged breccia. When the laser pulses hit this chaotic terrain, the photons scatter in a billion different directions. The data packet that returns to the spacecraft is noisy, jagged, and statistically random. It looks exactly like what it is, the aftermath of a blind, unthinking universe smashing rocks together. As Artemis II drifted over the deepest, most heavily shadowed quadrant of the South Pole Aitken Basin, the topographic feed should have reflected this ancient chaos. The basin floor is billions of years old, subjected to endless micrometeorite rain that should have churned the surface into a soft, uniform layer of dust known as regolith. But the telemetry streaming into the navigation buffers did not show fractal noise. Over a localized area spanning roughly 14.6 kilometers across, the scattering effect simply ceased. The LiDAR pulses did not bounce off a jagged, pulverized surface. They struck something that reflected the light back with a terrifying uniform coherence. The topographical map generated by the computer did not display the expected sloping curves of a crater basin. It displayed a sheer mathematical drop, followed by a plane of absolute Cartesian flatness. In planetary geology, true flatness does not exist. Even the vast basaltic plains of the near side, the Maria, are undulating and warped by subsurface settling. But the floor of this specific region within the Aitken Basin registered a deviation of less than 3 millimeters over a span of several miles. It was a surface smoother than a precisely milled optical lens, buried in the dark of a 4-billion-year-old impact zone. This geometric impossibility was immediately compounded by the thermal imaging data. Alongside the LiDAR, the spacecraft was passively recording the thermal inertia of the surface below. Thermal inertia is a measure of how rapidly a material responds to changes in temperature. The lunar regolith, the fine, powdery dust that covers almost everything, is a fantastic insulator. Because it is highly porous and there is no atmosphere to conduct heat, the dust heats up rapidly when exposed to sunlight and freezes almost instantly the moment it crosses into shadow. Solid, dense bedrock, however, takes much longer to heat up and retains that heat long into the lunar night. By analyzing how the surface radiates microwave and infrared energy, scientists can determine exactly what the crust is made of without ever touching it. The deep regions of the Aitken Basin are permanently shadowed, having not seen the light of the sun in billions of years. The ambient temperature in these craters hovers around 30 Kelvin, barely above absolute zero. At these temperatures, the molecular vibration of matter almost grinds to a halt. The thermal sensors expected to read a uniform, freezing void of ancient dust. Instead, the localized flat area detected by the LiDAR registered a staggering thermal contradiction. It was not radiating heat, but it was not acting like insulated dust either. The sensors detected a localized zone of hyperconductivity. It was acting as a massive, impossibly efficient heat sink. To understand this, imagine the intricate, humming architecture of a global server farm, tasked with processing millions of data packets a second. If the cooling systems fail, the latent heat generated by the processing power builds up, causing latency and eventual system death. To survive, the servers require a highly engineered thermal architecture to bleed the heat away instantly. The anomaly in the Aitken Basin was exhibiting the thermal properties of a massive hyperconductive heat sink, bleeding away the background microwave radiation of the universe with an efficiency that defies natural metallurgy. It suggested that beneath the obscuring layer of surface dust, the flat geometric structure was composed of an alloy or a super-dense material entirely alien to the established isotopic ratios of the lunar crust. The sheer scale of this contradiction forces us to re-examine everything we know about the deep interior of the Moon. For decades, the dominant theory regarding the South Pole Aitken Basin was that the primordial impact was so violent, it punched straight through the Moon's crust and exposed the mantle. If this were true, we would expect to see vast quantities of olivine and pyroxene, the heavy, iron-rich minerals that make up the planetary interior. We expected a wound that had bled molten rock from the core. But the data gathered by the Artemis II flyby, combined with historical anomalies we have ignored for too long, paints a much darker picture. To see the complete architecture of this mystery, we must look back to a seemingly unrelated mission launched a decade earlier. The Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory, or GRAIL. The GRAIL mission was an elegant piece of orbital mechanics. It consisted of two identical spacecraft, named Ebb and Flow, flying in a low polar orbit around the Moon, separated by a few hundred miles. They did not take pictures, they did not fire lasers. All they did was constantly, obsessively measure the exact distance between themselves down to the width of a red blood cell. As the first spacecraft flew over a region of the Moon with a higher density of mass, the slight increase in gravitational pull would accelerate it just a fraction of a millimeter forward, slightly increasing the distance between it and the second spacecraft. By mapping these microscopic changes in velocity over months, scientists created a hyper-accurate map of the Moon's gravitational field. They were looking for mass concentrations, or mascons, dense pockets of heavy material buried deep underground, usually the remnants of heavy asteroid cores that buried themselves in the lunar crust during the late heavy bombardment. When the GRAIL data over the South Pole Aitken Basin was processed, the scientific community was quietly unsettled. Buried hundreds of miles beneath the surface of the basin was a mass anomaly so staggeringly huge, it warped the gravity field of the entire southern hemisphere. We are talking about a concentration of mass weighing roughly 2.4 quintillion tons. It is an area of hyperdense material, roughly 5 times the size of the big island of Hawaii, lodged like a bullet in the deep lunar mantle. At the time, the official explanation, the only explanation that fit our safe naturalistic models, was that this was the metallic core of the asteroid that originally created the basin, surviving the impact and sinking into the magma ocean. But the Artemis II surface data shatters this comforting hypothesis. The perfect 14-kilometer geometric flat plane of hyperconductive material on the surface is located exactly at the gravitational epicenter of the deep mantle mascon discovered by GRAIL. This is not a coincidence. This is structural alignment. It suggests that the surface anomaly is not a localized artifact, but merely the exposed terminal end of a monolithic structure that extends hundreds of miles deep into the dead core of the Moon. We are looking at a system of mass and geometry that spans from the vacuum of the surface down into the frozen primordial mantle. The implications of this scale are profoundly disturbing. Information theory tells us that the universe trends toward entropy, toward disorder and randomness. To maintain low entropy, to create perfect geometry, thermal regulation, and structural alignment over hundreds of miles, requires the continuous, deliberate application of energy. It requires an architecture of intent. Why had we never seen this surface anomaly before? Why did it require a manned spacecraft diving into the communications blackout of the far side to discover it? The answer lies in the brutal mechanics of orbital illumination. The Moon's axis of rotation is almost perfectly perpendicular to the ecliptic plane, meaning it has virtually no seasons. At the lunar poles, the sun never rises high into the sky. It merely scrapes along the horizon, casting shadows that stretch for hundreds of miles. Deep craters at the poles, like those within the Aitken Basin, are permanently shadowed regions. They are abyssal zones where sunlight has not touched the surface in over 4 billion years. Our primary orbital eye, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, has spent over a decade mapping the Moon. But mapping the bottom of a permanently shadowed crater, using only the faint ambient starlight and the scattering of secondary photons, is an exercise in optical starvation. It is like trying to photograph the architectural details of a sprawling, abandoned city at 3 in the morning. under a thick, overcast sky, using only the ambient glow of fireflies miles away. The cameras on the LRO, while powerful, operate on long exposure times in these regions, which introduces motion blur and significantly degrades resolution. They saw the darkness, they saw the general depression of the terrain, but they lacked the localized active illumination required to see the geometry hidden within the black. Artemis II brought its own light. The active LiDAR pulses sliced through the permanent shadow, momentarily illuminating the architecture of the void. And what it revealed was a structure that refuses to conform to the geology of a dead world. The sheer edges of the anomaly do not slope down into the regolith. They plunge vertically, suggesting walls or boundaries that descend deep beneath the surface dust. The surface itself does not register the microscopic pitting of billions of years of solar wind and micrometeorite impacts, implying that either the material is impossibly resilient or the structure is actively resisting the degrading forces of the cosmos. When you look at the raw data numbers, the 14.6-kilometer diameter, the sub-millimeter topological variance, the specific thermal conductivity rates, and the perfect geographic alignment with a multi-quintillion-ton mass anomaly deep in the mantle, the human mind instinctively tries to find a natural geological process to explain it away. We invent theories of bizarre, ultra-rare volcanic upwellings or exotic magnetic field interactions. We do this because the alternative is a psychological cliff we are not prepared to jump off. If this structure is not natural, it means our entire understanding of the lunar timeline is a localized delusion. It means that while the Earth was still a boiling ocean of magma, while the very first single-celled organisms were struggling to synthesize proteins in the primordial soup, something of unimaginable scale and technological capacity was already operating in our orbit. It means the Moon was not merely a silent witness to our evolution, it was an occupied territory. The telemetry from Artemis II paints a picture of a mechanism that has been sitting in absolute freezing silence for eons, buried under the bombardment of the solar system, waiting. The measurements are cold, hard, and unforgiving. They do not care about our history, our philosophies, or our profound sense of isolation in the universe. The numbers simply exist, a towering mathematical monument to an intelligence that operates on a scale we can barely conceptualize. And as the orbital mechanics dictate, that silent, hyperdense geometry remains locked away on the far side, forever facing the deep irradiated ocean of interstellar space, turning its back to us as if we are entirely inconsequential. To fully process the terror of this discovery, we have to acknowledge the fragile psychological contract humanity has signed with the universe. We call this contract physics. For the last 400 years, since the Enlightenment dragged us out of superstition, we have desperately tried to codify the cosmos into a set of predictable, unbreakable rules. We formulated the standard model of particle physics and the elegant, sweeping curves of general relativity. We built an entire civilization on the foundational belief that the universe, while vast and indifferent, is at least mathematically rational. We assume with a profound collective arrogance that the laws governing a falling apple in a terrestrial orchard are the exact same laws governing the nuclear fusion of a distant quasar. We require this uniformity to stay sane. When we aim a telescope into the dark and observe a phenomenon, we immediately attempt to force it into our established equations. If the data does not fit, we assume the instrument is flawed. If the instrument is perfect, we assume our observation is incomplete. What we absolutely refuse to do, what our academic institutions are inherently designed to prevent, is to admit that the foundational mathematics of our reality might be fundamentally broken. But the telemetry transmitted from the dark side of the Moon cannot be smoothed over by calibration errors or missing variables. It stands as a macroscopic violation of the most guarded laws of nature, creating a theoretical impasse that is quietly tearing the astrophysical community apart. The first barrier we hit, the one that shatters our understanding of thermal equilibrium, is the localized behavior of the anomaly itself. To understand why the thermal data from Artemis II is so deeply unsettling, we must look at the unforgiving mechanics of thermodynamics. In the late 19th century, physicists like Ludwig Boltzmann drove themselves to the brink of madness, and in Boltzmann's case to ultimate tragedy, proving that the universe is governed by entropy. The second law of thermodynamics is the ultimate grim reaper of physics. It states irreversibly that heat must flow from a hotter body to a colder body until a perfectly dead equilibrium is reached. In the frozen, permanently shadowed craters of the Aitken Basin, the ambient temperature is hovering near 30 Kelvin, a state so cold that atmospheric gases would freeze solid and shatter like glass. According to every model of planetary science, a dense metallic or geologic structure, buried in this environment for 4 billion years, should have long ago reached thermal equilibrium with the surrounding regolith. It should be totally inert. But the anomaly is acting as an impossibly efficient heat sink, actively bleeding away the faint cosmic microwave background radiation and the microscopic latent heat of the lunar rock. It is absorbing energy without rising in temperature, and critically, without radiating that thermal energy back out into the vacuum. Imagine dropping a solid block of ice into a roaring industrial furnace, only to watch the ice remain perfectly frozen while the furnace itself slowly begins to freeze. This is a gross violation of thermal conservation. Where is the absorbed energy going? In standard physics, energy cannot simply be deleted. It must be converted or transferred. If the anomaly is a hyperconductive heat sink, it must possess an internal capacity for energy storage that approaches the infinite, or it is utilizing a mechanism of heat transfer that operates completely outside the boundaries of three-dimensional thermodynamics. The scientific frustration here is palpable. Astrophysicists are staring at a structure that treats the unbreakable laws of entropy as if they were merely polite suggestions. This thermal impossibility, however, is merely a symptom of a much larger catastrophic failure of our mechanical physics. The true nightmare lies miles below the surface, rooted in the staggering density of the mass concentration discovered by the Grail mission and now geometrically linked to the surface anomaly. We must examine the brutal reality of orbital kinetics. The human brain struggles to comprehend deep time and celestial mass, so we rely on mathematics to scale our intuition. The mascon buried beneath the Aitken Basin weighs an estimated 2.4 quintillion tons. The widely accepted theory, the desperate attempt to naturalize this nightmare, was that this mass is the surviving iron-nickel core of an ancient asteroid. Let us subject that theory to the cold light of kinetic physics. When celestial bodies collide, they do not simply bump into one another. They strike at hypervelocity, traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour. At these speeds, the physical properties of solid matter cease to matter. Rock and metal do not shatter. They behave like liquids and gases under the immense transfer of kinetic energy. The mathematical equation for kinetic energy is ruthless. It scales with the square of the velocity. If an asteroid massive enough to contain a 2.4 quintillion-ton solid core struck the Moon, the kinetic energy released would not just leave a deep crater. The energy transfer would exceed the gravitational binding energy of the Moon itself. Gravitational binding energy is the exact amount of invisible glue required to hold a celestial body together against the explosive force of its own internal pressures and any external kinetic impacts. If you exceed this threshold, the planet does not just dent, it structurally unbinds. It shatters into a molten ring of debris. Trying to embed a mass that large into the lunar mantle via a ballistic impact is the physical equivalent of firing a high-caliber sniper rifle into a delicate glass ornament and expecting the glass to peacefully swallow the bullet without shattering. The math is absolute. An impact of that magnitude would have destroyed the Moon, turning it into a temporary asteroid belt orbiting the early Earth. Therefore, by the ironclad laws of kinetic energy, the mascon could not have arrived via an impact. If it did not crash into the Moon, it had to be placed there. And this realization forces us straight into a wall of technological impossibility. To place a mass of 2.4 quintillion tons gently into the deep mantle of a celestial body requires deceleration. In the vacuum of space, you cannot use friction or aerodynamics to slow down. You are bound by the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, the fundamental tyranny of orbital mechanics. To decelerate a mass, you must expel a corresponding amount of reaction mass in the opposite direction. To decelerate a multi-quintillion-ton object from interstellar velocities down to a dead stop within the lunar gravity well, would require a propulsion system generating thrust on a planetary scale. The amount of chemical or even nuclear reaction mass required to achieve this deceleration would physically exceed the total mass of the Earth. It is an engineering paradox that breaks the known limits of energy generation. We are looking at the footprint of a mechanism that manipulates gravity and inertia as easily as we manipulate electricity. As if the kinetic paradox were not enough, the material composition of the structure presents an impenetrable barrier to our understanding of baryonic matter. Normal matter, the substance that makes up everything from the cells in your body to the core of Jupiter, is mostly empty space. Atoms are vast, vacant electron clouds orbiting microscopic nuclei. The density of any natural material is strictly limited by electron degeneracy pressure. When gravity or external force tries to crush atoms too closely together, the electrons violently repel one another, a principle dictated by the Pauli exclusion principle in quantum mechanics. On Earth, the densest naturally occurring element is osmium. It is incredibly heavy, but it still obeys the rules of empty atomic space. To pack 2.4 quintillion tons of mass into the specific localized volume recorded beneath the Aitken Basin requires a density that cannot exist under standard planetary conditions. If we run the volume-to-mass calculations, the numbers suggest a material density that flirts terrifyingly with degenerate matter. This is the stuff of dead stars. When a massive star runs out of nuclear fuel, its own immense gravity crushes its core, forcing electrons into the protons to create a solid sphere of neutrons. This neutronium is so dense that a single teaspoon of it would weigh billions of tons. But neutronium can only exist within the crushing, localized gravity well of a collapsed stellar core. If you were to somehow extract a block of neutron star material and bring it to the low-gravity environment of our solar system, the absence of that crushing stellar gravity would allow the internal quantum pressures to instantly decompress. The material would violently expand, detonating with the energetic yield of a localized supernova. Degenerate matter cannot exist in the shallow gravity of the Moon. It is physically prohibited. Yet, the mascon is there. The density is real. This implies that whatever architecture sits dormant inside the Moon is utilizing a localized containment field, a mechanism to artificially sustain the pressures required to keep hyperdense matter stable outside of a stellar core. It suggests the manipulation of the strong nuclear force on a macroscopic scale. We have spent billions of dollars building massive subterranean particle accelerators, like the Large Hadron Collider, just to smash subatomic particles together for a fraction of a nanosecond to glimpse these forces. The anomaly suggests an engineering paradigm that treats quantum chromodynamics as a structural building material. This brings us to the final, and perhaps most frustrating, physical barrier, the problem of time and structural integrity. The surface of the Moon is often described as geologically dead, but this is a misconception. The Moon is a massive, rigid body locked in a complex gravitational dance with the Earth and the Sun. As it orbits, the shifting gravitational pull of the Earth physically warps the lunar sphere, a process called tidal flexing. This constant stretching and squeezing generates deep structural stress. Between 1969 and 1972, the Apollo astronauts deployed a network of highly sensitive seismometers across the near side of the Moon. For 8 years, these instruments listened to the heartbeat of the lunar interior. They recorded thousands of moonquakes. Some were shallow, caused by the extreme temperature swings of the lunar day fracturing the surface rock. But others were deep, resonating hundreds of miles below the crust, driven by the relentless tidal flexing. The Moon is constantly shuddering, cracking and shifting on a microscopic scale. Now consider the 14.6-kilometer geometric plane discovered by Artemis II. Over 4 billion years, that region of the Moon has been subjected to billions of deep mantle moonquakes. It has endured the constant grinding stress of planetary tidal forces. In our understanding of material sciences, there is no rigid structure, no alloy, no carbon nanotube composite that could span nearly 15 kilometers and maintain a surface variance of less than 3 millimeters over deep geological time. Any natural or manufactured rigid body would have buckled, fractured, or accumulated severe microscopic fault lines. The sheer mechanical stress of a planetary body warping around it would have shattered the perfect geometry. To maintain that absolute Cartesian flatness against billions of years of seismic violence requires one of two terrifying realities. Either the material possesses a tensile strength that approaches infinity, rendering it immune to the transfer of kinetic and seismic waves, which breaks the physical limits of atomic bonds. Or far worse, the structure is not static. The absolute lack of degradation implies that the geometry is actively maintained. It suggests a system that is constantly, quietly repairing itself, bleeding off seismic energy, and correcting its own topological map on a molecular level against the grinding gears of the lunar mantle. The astrophysicists and planetary geologists who hold clearances high enough to view the raw Artemis telemetry are trapped in a profound epistemological nightmare. They are staring at a dataset that demands the total rewriting of orbital mechanics, thermodynamics, and quantum material sciences. The naturalists desperately try to model bizarre, unprecedented volcanic upwellings or exotic, never-before-seen magnetic condensations, twisting the math into agonizing contortions to avoid the obvious. But the equations do not balance. The barrier is not merely physical rock and shadow. It is a mathematical barricade separating humanity from a reality we are not intellectually equipped to handle. We are like ancient mariners trying to deduce the internal workings of a nuclear submarine using only astrolabes and a deep fear of the ocean. The structure exists. It violates our physics. It ignores our entropy. And as the orbital trajectory of the Orion capsule pulled it further away, the sensors recorded one final transient data point that plunged the mission scientists into absolute silence. A microscopic shift in the thermal bleed, a change in the latency. That change in latency is the single most terrifying data point in the entire history of human exploration. In the realm of computer science, latency is the time it takes for a system to process an input and generate a response. It is the microscopic hesitation of a processor waking up, allocating memory and executing a subroutine. When the high-frequency LiDAR pulses from the Artemis II spacecraft struck the impossibly smooth, hyperconductive surface buried in the Aitken Basin, the geometric plane did not simply reflect the light back like dead rock. The thermal imaging recorded a fractional temporary drop in the structure's heat dissipation rate, followed by a sudden microsecond compensation. The system absorbed the kinetic energy of our lasers, analyzed the coherent photon stream, and actively adjusted its thermodynamic camouflage to mask the interaction. It was not a reflection, it was a reflex. The structure is not a fossil of a dead civilization. It is an active, functioning machine, and for the first time in 4 billion years, it registered that something was knocking on its door. The consequences of this realization violently dismantle the foundational pillars of our civilization. For over a century, we have operated under the profound delusion that we are the sole, lonely protagonists of the cosmos. We have aimed massive radio telescopes at distant star systems, desperately broadcasting our location, our mathematics, and our biology into the void, hoping to hear a whisper in the dark. We formulated the Fermi paradox, agonizing over why the universe seems so empty, assuming that the great filter, the theoretical barrier that destroys civilizations before they can reach the stars, was somewhere ahead of us. Perhaps it was nuclear war, or climate collapse, or artificial intelligence. We assumed the silence of the galaxy was proof of our unique survival, but the anomaly on the far side of the moon forces a catastrophic recalibration of this paradox. The universe is not silent because it is empty, or because intelligence is rare. The universe is silent because it is actively, aggressively hiding. To understand the terrifying logic of this, we must look at the brutal thermodynamics of survival in deep time. Any advanced technological civilization, no matter how exotic its physics, must generate waste heat. Computation, energy manipulation, and physical infrastructure all produce a thermal signature that radiates out into the freezing vacuum of space. In a universe governed by ruthless celestial mechanics, a heat signature is a beacon. To build a structure with the mass of 2.4 quintillion tons, and to bury it hundreds of miles deep within a tidally locked moon, utilizing the entire celestial body as a massive, ablative heat sink requires a level of engineering paranoia that defies human comprehension. You do not construct a subterranean fortress of degenerate matter, camouflaged from all electromagnetic and thermal detection, unless you are acutely aware of a predatory force capable of wiping you out. The structure on the far side of the moon is not an outpost for peaceful observation. Its architecture is explicitly defensive. It is a bunker, and this realization implies a cosmic ecology that is deeply, violently hostile. If an entity capable of manipulating the gravitational binding energy of planets feels the need to hide in the dark, masking its thermal exhaust against the background radiation of the universe, what unimaginable horror is it hiding from? By firing our active targeting lasers into the darkest crater of our own moon, we have not only alerted the occupant of the bunker to our technological awakening, but we may have inadvertently compromised their camouflage. This brings us to the devastating redefinition of human history. We are infected with a deep, evolutionary arrogance. We believe we climbed out of the primordial soup, conquered the fire, split the atom, and claimed dominion over the earth through our own sheer biological brilliance. We track our history in centuries and millennia, viewing the rise and fall of empires as grand, sweeping epics. But in the face of the lunar anomaly, our entire existence is reduced to a microscopic, temporary fungal bloom on a wet rock. Consider the timeline. 4 billion years ago, while the Earth was still a toxic boiling ocean of magma, incapable of sustaining even the most basic amino acids, this mechanism was already buried in the lunar mantle. It watched the crust of our planet cool. It watched the oceans form from the condensation of millions of cometary impacts. It remained perfectly silent as the dinosaurs reigned for hundreds of millions of years and were subsequently incinerated by an asteroid. It sat in the freezing dark while multiple ice ages ground our continents into dust. Every single moment of human suffering, every war, every mathematical breakthrough, and every prayer ever whispered to the sky occurred directly under the indifferent surveillance of a multi-quintillion-ton machine that manipulated gravity before we had even evolved a spine. We are not the masters of this solar system. We are an uninvited biological byproduct that managed to sprout in the immediate vicinity of a sleeping god. We have lived our entire evolutionary lifespan inside a terrarium, entirely oblivious to the glass walls. And our desperate long-term plans for survival, the colonization of Mars, the mining of the asteroid belt, the expansion of humanity across the solar system, are instantly rendered infantile and utterly pointless. We cannot expand into a territory that has been claimed for 4 billion years by an intelligence that operates on a scale of physics we cannot even model mathematically. If this dormant architecture decides that our sudden technological expansion is a nuisance or worse, a liability that threatens to draw the attention of whatever predatory force it is hiding from, our eradication would not be a cinematic war. There would be no invading fleets, no laser fire in the sky, no time for heroic resistance. The destruction of humanity would be an exercise in sterile, silent mathematics. The mass concentration buried beneath the Aitken Basin controls the gravitational center of the lunar southern hemisphere. If the mechanism simply decided to shift its internal mass by a fraction of a percent, the orbital mechanics of the moon would instantly alter. The moon exerts a massive tidal pull on the Earth, not just on our oceans, but on the molten mantle churning beneath our feet. A microscopic change in the moon's gravitational output would trigger a cascade of tidal flexing across our planet. The resulting tectonic stress would instantly fracture the continental plates. The ring of fire would detonate simultaneously, choking the atmosphere in volcanic ash, while hyper-tsunamis miles high scoured the surface of the continents clean of all biological material. It would take less than 72 hours to return the Earth to a sterile rock, and the mechanism on the far side of the moon would not even have to fire a weapon. It would simply adjust its posture. We have spent the last 50 years building complex legal treaties regarding the militarization of space, arguing over who owns the mineral rights to the lunar surface. We have drafted policies on how to avoid contaminating celestial bodies with human bacteria. This geopolitical posturing is the equivalent of an ant colony debating the ownership of a highway while a paving machine idles just out of sight. We have absolutely no agency in the future of this solar system. The illusion of our independence has been completely shattered by the telemetry of a single brief flyby. The psychological toll of this data is already bleeding through the secured doors of the astrophysics community. To look at the Artemis II returns is to experience a profound terminal vertigo. It is the sudden, crushing realization that our physics is a child's sandbox, our history is an accident, and our future is entirely dependent on the continued, terrifying indifference of a machine we cannot comprehend. We are trapped in a profound state of helplessness, suspended over an abyss of deep time and cosmic engineering. We are forced to confront the chilling possibility that the communication blackout experienced by every Apollo mission, and now by Artemis II as they slipped behind the moon, was not just a natural byproduct of a rock-blocking radio waves. It was a physical boundary, a quarantine line drawn in the vacuum of space, separating the noisy, chaotic evolution of the Earth from the silent, perfect geometry of the far side. We were allowed to play in the shallow waters of the near side, picking up basaltic rocks and planting our fragile cloth flags, precisely because we posed no threat. We were ignorant. But ignorance is a temporary state, and with the active probing of the Aitken Basin, we have crossed an invisible threshold. We are no longer blind. We have seen the shape in the dark, and more terrifyingly, the shape has registered that we are looking. The delicate equilibrium of the last 4 billion years has been irrevocably altered. A clock, utilizing a mechanism of time we do not understand, has quietly begun to tick. We cannot hear this clock. It does not measure seconds or hours, but eons, orbital shifts, and the slow decay of isotopes. We are completely blind to its countdown, paralyzed by our own evolutionary infancy. For centuries, our philosophers, poets, and scientists have gazed up at that glowing silver disk in the night sky, desperately projecting our fragile human emotions onto its barren surface. We saw ancient deities, we saw the passage of seasons, and eventually we saw a stepping stone for our glorious, inevitable cosmic destiny. We wrote sonnets to an armored shield. We composed our greatest symphonies to a silent, heavily fortified tomb. This is the ultimate crushing weight of the Artemis anomaly. It does not merely break our physics, it systematically dismantles our entire narrative purpose. Humanity has always operated under the comforting, arrogant assumption of a protagonist's immunity. We fundamentally believed the universe was an empty, sterile stage waiting for us to arrive and perform, a vast, quiet ocean waiting for our primitive ships to set sail. But the telemetry has proven that the stage has been occupied since the dawn of time, and the deep ocean is teeming with apex leviathans that operate in dimensions of mass, energy, and thermodynamics that we cannot even perceive, let alone challenge. When you truly comprehend the terrifying scale of a multi-quintillion-ton architecture designed explicitly to hide from an unknown cosmic predator, human history instantly dissolves into a mathematical rounding error. All of our grand, sweeping achievements, our sprawling megacities, our subterranean nuclear arsenals, our intricate global digital networks, they offer the exact same defensive capability as a thin layer of frost clinging to a rock in the path of an advancing glacier. We are entirely devoid of leverage in this paradigm. We cannot negotiate with the cold, unfeeling mathematics of the void. We cannot fight or outmaneuver an intelligence that utilizes planetary mass as a basic building material and treats the unbreakable laws of entropy as trivial engineering hurdles. The true horror of the cosmos is not that it is chaotic or violent or burning with stellar fire. The true horror is its absolute suffocating indifference. The machine beneath the Aitken Basin does not hate us. It does not love us. It simply does not care that we exist, any more than a human architect cares about the microscopic bacteria living on the foundation of a skyscraper. Tonight, when the sun finally dips below the horizon and the sky darkens, walk outside and look up at that familiar glowing sphere. Observe the Terminator line, the stark, jagged boundary between light and shadow on the lunar surface. For your entire life, you have been taught that the darkness hiding on the far side is just dead rock and ancient dust, a quiet landscape patiently waiting for our eventual return. But the darkness is not empty. It is heavily armored. It is mathematically perfect. And for the first time since the Earth cooled from a molten, lifeless sphere, the architecture residing in that darkness is actively calculating the new variable we have introduced into its environment. The universe is not a nursery designed to nurture our potential. It is a very dark, very quiet forest, and we, in our profound, tragic ignorance, have just struck a match and shouted into the night.